Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. All eyes are on President-elect Trump's second administration and what its agenda may mean for policies. Joining us to share her insights on the potential impact of last week's election on business is Roz Brooks. Roz, welcome.
Thanks, Sindhu. Happy to be here.
So let's start with what the rest of the year is going to look like. So I know that everybody's focused on 2025 and we're at the very beginning of a lame duck session. And I want to know, what does the rest of the year look like? And does the election outcome affect the to-do list?
Of course, the election outcome always affects the to-do list in a lame duck. But look, right now we know government funding needs to be addressed. The current government funding expires on December 20th. We also know the National Defense Authorization Act is something we typically get done at the end of the year. The Farm Bill is expiring. There is talk about, does President-elect Trump want to clear the decks around government funding, take it beyond and off the plate so they can focus on reconciliation as a first step in the new administration with respect to tax. And there's something in the process where if you don't take it off the table, it can impact the timing for reconciliation. So will that be the avenue that they try to pursue? It's also the case that Democrats still maintain control in the Senate until the end of the year and the White House. And so there's some thought that, is there any power they can exert to try to influence, lock in some spending levels on programs they care deeply about? But I'm waiting until we get some readout from the leadership elections, the Republican leadership elections, and then their confab with President-elect Trump.
So it appears that there will be a Republican trifecta, so the House, the Senate, and the White House, once former President Trump takes office in January. So based on what the Republicans talked about during the campaign, what do you think are the top items for the incoming administration?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that the tax package is first and foremost on the agenda simply because of the ability in a Republican trifecta to utilize the reconciliation process. And so I think there'll be a lot of focus because you have to determine what your top line number is. There's a lot of things that go into getting reconciliation instructions put together beyond just saying, oh, we can avoid the filibuster in the Senate by doing it. So I expect that to be a top item in the first 100 days. There's talk of them wanting to get something done by April 30th.
Okay.
So we'll see whether or not that can be done, because I think a critical point, and I know you will have many podcasts or webcasts about this, will be on, can they agree? What are the deficit hawks going to be able to stomach in terms of a top line number adding to the debt? How much are they going to be able to pay for as part of this package? I think the other thing is immigration and border security. We have a border czar named, and we know that there's going to be a tremendous focus around illegal immigration as well as legal immigration. So what will that look like in the first 100 days? We'll have to see. And then beyond that, we know that there's going to be a ton of reversal of Biden executive orders day one when they come in, the expectation that there's already a plan in place looking at a number of regulations throughout the Biden administration to see that they can pull back, roll back, or kind of negate in some form or fashion.
Okay. I want to go back to the April 30th date. I'm guessing that's aggressive?
Well, it depends on who you ask.
Right.
I would think, I know our own analysts have thought it aggressive in terms of saying that you can potentially get agreement on what that top line number is going to be. There's going to be concern about how much you're adding to the debt. What are the negotiations over some of the more popular provisions that President-elect Trump talked about during the campaign that weren't in the original TCJA package? And so how is that going to all come together and who's going to pay for it? So I do think it's an ambitious goal, but you look at what's going on, they've got a number of their cabinet appointments named, and the expectation is we will have like many more by early December so that a Republican Senate can start confirmation day one. It's a matter of like getting paperwork and all that in. So if they're moving along in a number of other areas, I think they're very optimistic about their ability to do this. Look, and this is a little bit off topic, but neither branch of government likes to have the other branch meddle in their affairs, okay? And so neither chamber, House or Senate, like to have either chamber or the White House meddling in their affairs. And I do think there are some who feel that the Senate leadership elections are kind of their thing. And while President-elect Trump hasn't verbally, publicly endorsed any particular person as yet, there's so much noise within the conservative base about showing preference for a particular candidate and how that may impact kind of the election, the Senate leadership election, that I'm waiting to see who emerges and how feelings are after post election in
Right.
terms of the willingness of one or two senators to kind of maybe buck the trend and be a thorn in the side in those first 100 days. It's hard to imagine given the overwhelming way in which President-elect Trump won, and the fact that you're maintaining a Republican trifecta. You would think everyone wants to move together and let's get this done, but you got to watch those nuances where there could be little, concerns. I don't want to be so petty as to call it hurt feelings, but we're all human, right?
Right.
And so you've got to watch these nuances that could portend for what happens when they need certain senators in the future.
And relationships can be tricky.
They are very tricky.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
tricky.
So in past Republican administrations, there's been a kind of a deregulatory approach. So we are going from a Democratic back to a Republican administration. So I'd like for you to talk about what that process is going to be like, but especially for issues like Gen AI, trade, and climate and sustainability.
So, Sindhu, I think that's right? We can expect in this type of environment with a Republican trifecta and a Republican White House to see a lot of deregulatory measures and efforts going into place. I mentioned earlier about the focus on rolling back a lot of Biden-era executive orders, looking at regulations, whether it's at the EPA or other places, that they can roll back some of that or negate some of those issues, some of those regulations. But I think there's going to be a balance that maybe business has to pay attention to. Again, as I talked about the nuance, right? There's a lot said about the close relationship that President-elect Trump has with Elon Musk. We know that Elon Musk is very much about AI safety and responsible use of AI, and has espoused concerns over, grave concerns about if you let AI kind of run amok in innovation. But at the same time, we want to innovate. So could you see what people may not be expecting, maybe some guardrails around AI and different types of technologies that could be considered a concern kind of for future existence of humanity, if you will. So generally speaking, I think, that's right. Everyone's focused obviously on what this is going to mean kind of from a trade standpoint. Think about, again, if you think about immigration for a lot of businesses during the first Trump administration, there was a restriction from an ICE perspective around, and U.S. Customs and Enforcement around number of visas that are put out, like some of the regulations for businesses in terms of how you qualify or demonstrate that you qualify for certain types of visas. So you can see in some areas where there would be stricter regulation and stricter requirements, where in other places, generally speaking, kind of the notion of let's open up, whether you're talking about energy, you're talking about maybe even some things around technology, like I said, balancing what we may see in terms of wanting to have a few safeguards.
Okay. Let's switch over to tax, something we
Yes.
talk about a lot on this show.
Yes.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, there are provisions expiring at the end of 2025. And during the campaign, former President Trump talked about reinstating them. So how does this square away with the very narrow margin and the use of reconciliation?
Yeah, well, I think, look, the expectation, as I said, with the Republican trifecta is that the president-elect is going to be able to get through. He's going to be given the benefit of the doubt and be able to have the support of that Congress and getting through his agenda. So the expectations would be for the TCJA provisions that he talked about, that you should be able to see kind of I wouldn't say expansion, a continuation of those provisions. Again, nuance, right? The devil is in the details in terms of, I mentioned before, there are deficit hawks and those who are concerned about the rising debt within the Republican conference. And so, where is the negotiation and the compromise in terms of how big of a tax package are you going to be able to get? What compromise is that going to require? Um, you have still some Republican members of Congress who are from blue states who are challenged by the SALT deduction. Like, what will you see in terms of negotiating and compromise about that? You've had President-elect Trump on the campaign trail talk about tax proposals that weren't in TCJA. How will that impact the ability to continue those provisions? Add on addition, think about no tax on tips, think about the notion of the possibility of not taxing Social Security. Like, how will those things come together in a package? And couple that with the complications of reconciliation instructions and the timeline we talked about when they're trying to get it done. I should have said, when you said things to be done in the lame duck, yes, we have to get government funding. Yes, we have to do NDAA and the Farm Bill, but there's going to be an incredible amount of focus on tax and reconciliation instructions and how they're going to get that through for next year.
So, Roz, I want to find out what you're curious about as you look ahead to the second Trump administration.
I don't know about super focused on, but I think we've talked about a number of areas, a number of policy areas. And I know you've got other in-depth policy areas around healthcare and sustainability. But one of the things that I think is going to be interesting to see is what happens on the technology front, right? This is the one area where it fits with our competition with China. We want to make America the leader from an innovation standpoint. You think about AI or semiconductors, you name it. You think about all of the things that went into the CHIPS Act that was bipartisan. So technology is going to permeate everything we do. And it would be easy to think, okay, we've got an administration that's focused on deregulation. They're going to come in day one and roll back Biden's executive order around AI. It's all guardrails, all bets are off, and it's open season for innovation. But when you look at at least one of the president's closest confidants, we know for a fact he's been very outspoken about the need for safeguards as you think about AI and he supported California's bill around AI regulation, even though it was vetoed by Governor Newsom. So I do think it'll be interesting to see how they do that balance. It's perhaps the case that the executive order gets rolled back solely because it was a Biden executive order. And you may see some additional or different types of guardrails and safeguards put in place by a Trump administration. So it's one of the areas that I'm curious about, that I'm watching.
All right. And finally, we are filming this exactly a week after the election. And I'd like to know, what is a question that you have received since the election that might be thought-provoking or that might be relevant for across industries, across sectors?
I think one of the things people grapple with and they're trying to figure out is how will a second Trump administration differ from the first Trump administration? And I think once you get past the obvious about they're much more prepared this time around, you have to recognize that some of the players are different, right? You have congressional leaders who were not the leaders during the first administration. You don't have Senator McConnell, who will be leading Republicans. You now have a Speaker Johnson, presumably House elections are also this week, who also wasn't empowered during that time. And as we mentioned earlier, relationships can be challenging, tricky, nuanced. They are not kind of easy. And so how they all work together, not just in the first 100 days, which will be important, but kind of as you think about beyond that and the different, and how they lead their conferences and trying to unite and accomplish President-elect Trump's agenda, I think will be very interesting to watch and will help to portend what may be coming from a policy standpoint.
Roz, this has been great. I know we've talked about a lot, but I could keep talking to you about many other subjects and hope you'll come back.
I will.
All right. Thank you. This episode is part of a series looking at different policy initiatives under the second Trump administration. You can find other episodes in the series on our website and linked in the description of this episode. We appreciate you spending this time with us. Take care.